How's it going, guys? This is your budget gamer here, coming at you with a $700 gaming PC build. Now, this PC is actually fairly good because I can vouch for the parts. Majority of those parts are actually in my build at the moment. I have the same CPU, GPU, hard drive, and RAM. So without further ado, let's just begin. So for the CPU, I decided to choose the AMD FX6300. So this CPU runs at 3.5 gigahertz and is a 6-core processor, which is very good, considering now that next-gen games will probably take advantage of that. This runs on the AM3 Plus socket, has its own CPU cooler, and runs at a cool 95 watts. A lot of people have very good things to say about the CPU. The CPU is actually considered widely as the best bang for buck CPU, period, as it runs people around $130 and sometimes on sale even less, especially on Black Fridays. You're getting a lot with this CPU. It's also decent at video editing and rendering, but I wouldn't say it's your primary choice. Maybe renders videos within, like, is said to render videos within like a minute and a half, and so that's all right. I prefer probably maybe an i5 or an i9, i7 for that, but for gaming this is totally fine. For the motherboard, I decided to choose the MSI 970A. So this is an ATX motherboard. Has a lot of variations for different memory types, up to 2133 megahertz. Is also running the AM3 Plus socket. Supports up to 32 gigabytes of memory, so that's good. Also has RAID support, which means you can combine hard drives together, which is also nice, and also has Crossfire support. So if you have a bigger power supply, you can put more graphics cards onto this motherboard. It looks like you can probably put about 2 graphics cards, which is fine. It also has 6 gigabit per second ports, which means you can plug up to 6 hard drives or optical drives or whatever you want in terms of hard drive space. And also has onboard USB 3.0 headers, which is nice, because our case will have onboard USB headers as well, so that will also be great. For our memory, I decided to choose the Kingston HyperX Fury Black at 8 gigabytes, and this is 2 4 gigabyte sticks of that, running at DDR3 1600 megahertz. Just your typical kit of RAM. I also have this RAM in my build. It's pretty nice. Also has heat spreaders on it, I guess, if you wanted to overclock, and is a black and silver color scheme. Also, a thing to note is because it's also very low profile, so it seems like you'd be able to fit a lot more in the build. Let's say if you wanted to put a radiator up top on your case, it looks like this kit of RAM might not really interfere with that. Also runs you about $45, which is relatively cheap. Yep, so that's just typically it. 8 gigabytes of RAM for modern gaming seems pretty fine right now. I think the sweet spot is 16 gigabytes, but you're not going to be able to fit that in a $700 budget. But the cool thing about it is that you could just upgrade it later down the line, which is fine. For the hard drive, this is pretty much the bread and butter of most budget builds. The Western Digital Caviar Blue 1 terabyte hard drive. This is a 3.5-inch hard drive running at 7200 RPM, and it probably will boot up your OS within a minute and a half. Relatively short loading times of games. Skyrim probably 4 seconds of loading times. Most other games are almost instantaneous with their loading. This is fine. I would say, like, maybe in the future, get an SSD, or if you're being smart, get an SSD now and then get this hard drive later for the mass storage. At this budget, you might be able to only fit 120 gigabytes for an SSD, so it's not very smart right now. But if you were to get maybe a 250 gigabyte SSD and then get this hard drive later, you have almost a perfect optimal amount of space. Yep. So yeah. Either way, I'm just going to move on to the graphics card. So for the graphics card, I decided to choose the Sapphire Radeon R9 270X. Most 270Xs are a 2 gigabyte model. This one in particular is a 4 gigabyte VRAM model, which means you're going to be able to load more textures, and you're going to be able to run it at higher resolutions without worrying too much. I'm pretty sure this can run 1440p at around console settings. I have this card, but I run on a 1080p, so almost every game I have is 60 FPS, with the exception of a game like Witcher 3 or maybe poorly optimized games. It has a pretty good cooler. It's called the Dual X cooler. Relatively, if you push this graphics card hard, like every other graphics card, it's going to sound relatively loud, but for the most part, it's been a very good graphics card for me. If you run it at high settings, you're pretty much going to get really good. I wouldn't recommend maxing out every single game, especially the graphic intensive games. The only problem with this card, well, not really a problem, it runs at 180 watts, which is actually fairly high for most graphics cards, but our CPU runs at around 95 watts, so pretty much it kind of balances itself out. Neither of the parts bottleneck each other, they actually complement each other quite well. This also has crossfire support, so if you wanted to add another 270X, that would be great. And it has a lot of outports. So it has DVI port, it has a display port, and an HDMI port. So you can run Infinity multi-monitor displays if that is your choice. Yep. So yeah, this graphics card is pretty good. And it runs Counter-Strike around 150 frames a second, Witcher 3 around 50 frames a second, a lot of other games at 60 FPS though. So a lot of the latest games that you get to play them at relatively high settings and good frame rates. For the case, I decided to choose a Corsair Spec 01 Red ATX mid-tower case. Now this case is, if I could get the picture pulled up, this case has routing holes, as you can see here, for cable management, which is pretty nice, especially at a case at this price point. Also, it has a gap between the optical drive and the hard drive bays, which means you could probably put a graphics card as long as you want. It seems like you could probably have 3 or 4 fans at this point on the graphics card. And it also has a window on the side, so you can show off all your parts as you see fit. The color scheme you might want to go for is red, just because the LED fan is red. But yeah, this case at its budget seems awesome, and on top of that, it supports ATX, micro ATX, and mini ITX. Also has enough space for 4 hard drives or 2 CD optical drives, and has front panel USB headers, which is perfect because our motherboard supports that as well. And for the power supply, I decided to choose the EVGA 500 watt 80 plus bronze certified power supply. Now I have an EVGA power supply, it's quite nice, and I think it's actually relatively quiet. So I'm thinking that because mine might be relatively quiet at 650 watts, gold certified, I'm pretty sure the bronze certified is no different. The only difference is that this is not modular, which means you're going to have all the cables hanging out, but fortunately we have cable routing holes for our case, so I'm pretty sure you can either stuff it in the back behind all the parts or also behind the drive cage. Either way, it's going to be relatively clean in comparison to other cases at this price point, so you're not getting screwed over there. Plus it's bronze certified, which means it's relatively good in terms of its energy efficiency when it pulls energy from the wall. And yeah, it seems to be and for one graphics card, 500 watts will always be plenty. If you want more than that, if you want to do crossfire with this build, add 270Xs or any graphics cards you want, you're gonna have to invest in maybe a 700 or 800 watt power supply that has support for multiple PCI Express connectors for enough cables to power your graphics card. But for the most part, if you're just gonna have a single graphics card and upgrade it multiple times over the lifetime of this computer, you're going to be fine with 500 watts. This will last you a long time. So when you add all the parts together, it comes up to a base total of $686 with a shipping total of $10. If you wanted to take advantage of some of the mail and rebates that are on the motherboard and the power supply, however those last, it'll run you about $670. But yeah, this build is relatively good. I've used it for a year and a half, and I've super satisfied with it. Runs Windows 10 pretty well, boots up in about 20 seconds. Well, that's considering that I have an SSD, but for you, this build will probably boot up within a minute and 20 seconds, which is still fine. And games run well, tons of space, and it's overall a great build. Max wattage of 374 watts, but that's only if you push it to that point. It probably won't get to that point on its own. And also a note that the motherboard might need a BIOS update. That's not hard. Just go to the motherboard page, download the latest BIOS update for it, put it on a USB, and when your computer boots up, you just want to activate it through the BIOS and you'll be good. So either way, this is my $700 gaming build, and this is your budget gamer signing out.